Hello, I'm Mark Ellen. Thanks for listening to this Word in Your Ear, the latest of hundreds of conversations David Hepworth and I have had on this podcast that we started 17 years ago, some with ourselves, others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you enjoy them and want to support us and keep it all coming and get extra entertainment, including the weekly quiz and a special event on your birthday, visit patreon.com/wordinyour-ear or just like or subscribe in whatever way you prefer.
Okay, well, welcome to this Word in Your Ear with an old friend of the pod, Peter Ames Carlin, who's been with us in the past talking about REM. And I don't know, what else, Peter? Did we ever talk about Paul? You've written books about Paul Simon, Bruce Springsteen, all kinds of people. What have we talked about on the pod in the past? We talked about certainly REM last time.
We talked about REM, and I have a memory of us talking about Warner Brothers Records as well.
Right. Okay. Well, now the occasion is the publication just this week in the United States of Tonight in Jungleland, the making of Born to Run, Bruce Springsteen, Born to Run. Is that the anniversary this week of the record?
Not this week, but definitely this month. I think the anniversary, at least in the United States, is August 25th.
Right. Well, look, here we are in the middle of August, the traditional dog days of the music business. Everybody else is away on holiday. Mark Ellen's away. Young Alex is stowed away on a liner, plying up and down the northwest coast. So it's just you and me. There's probably nobody watching at all. We just, two old Springsteen bores can bore each other on the minutiae of that extraordinary project towards making that album, because it's not often that people, revisit one particular album in a book, but that's obviously the kind of pivotal point of Bruce Springsteen's career, isn't it? It's the whole Bruce Springsteen story goes back to that. Would you say that's the case?
It definitely runs through this album, because if it weren't for Born to Run, if he hadn't made the album that he had made, he may well have been dropped from Columbia Records, because they had seen enough of his very celebrated and yet barely selling early albums. The first two records, Greetings from Asbury Park and then The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle, sold, I think in their original run, something like 20,000 copies apiece, and that was not cutting it. And I don't think it would even cut it these days, but in the early 70s, that was a catastrophe of failure.
And also, it's kind of standard, isn't it, in the music business and the publishing business and so forth. We try you twice, and then if it doesn't work, we go out and spend our money on somebody different, which I think is a point of view that gets a very bad press, But I can kind of sympathize with the people making these decisions. We tried you, okay, that hasn't worked. Let's go and try somebody else. In this case, but you talk about his position at Columbia was made more parlous by the fact that Clive Davis, who'd been the kind of the boss man at the time that he first joined the company, had gone in a cloud of scandal, supposed, and he had a new guy from TV running the company who didn't know anything about him at all. But so he was hanging by a thread, wasn't he, really, with Columbia? What rescued him?
Well, a few things happened at the same time. I mean, for one thing, Bruce always had these apostles in the company, these younger executives who were so convinced that he was going to be the next huge thing. They could sense his talent. They could sense the promise there. And, so everything is so subjective in the music industry that if there are a handful of people who are willing to jump up and down and say, listen, this is the guy, we cannot miss out on this guy, it's hard for even the senior executives to go, no, I have better judgment than you. I mean, if they cut Bruce Springsteen loose and then suddenly he's on another label becoming Bruce Springsteen,
that's their nightmare, isn't it?
Yeah, it's super duper embarrassing. So if there's enough people there saying, no, this is the thing, then it gives them pause. And so in the spring of 74, there were just enough of those guys to keep him there. But then not only did the then eminent critic and magazine editor John Landau write a column for the Boston Phoenix, a No, actually, it was the Real Paper, which was an alternative to the alternative newspaper in Boston for complicated reasons. At the time, John saw a Springsteen show and was so blown away by it. He wrote this he went out on a very, very long and skinny branch and said, I have seen rock and roll future, and its name is Bruce Springsteen, which got a certain amount of attention on even the top executive floors at Columbia. But at the same time, that new executive who had taken over the company, the TV guy, Erwin Siegelstein, his son, James, was a student at Brown University. And Bruce did two things. He gave a concert at Brown that this kid saw. And second of all, he gave an interview with the newspaper. And he said, these guys at Columbia don't like me. They want to drop me. My career may be over. And the young Siegelstein was so impressed with the show, he called his dad and said, are you seriously going to drop this guy? Because I just saw him give like the greatest concert I've ever seen in my life. And so Erwin was like, uh-oh. And he immediately got in touch with Bruce's manager and said, you guys have to come in for lunch. And he just said, what do we have to do to make you guys happy?
So nepotism gets a bad rap, doesn't it? But I think in certain cases, it's a really good thing.
Every so often it's a bitter pill for us parents of grown children, but every so often it pays to listen to the little buggers. And sometimes they, but so in this case, the father was saved by the ears of the son.
So this brings us to the point that he'd made these two records, which had been underwhelming, really, in their impact on the market. But his star was rising as a live performer, wasn't it? And so that was what people were feeling. People who'd seen something in him live that even they recognized had not been captured on those previous records. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, part of the problem was that though it was those live shows that tended to really transform people, they were touring in station wagons, essentially, and a U-Haul truck. I mean, they were not getting very far away from their base in the Northeast. With some feelers down south and slightly to the west, but they hadn't really played many shows on the West Coast. They hadn't really played in the upper Midwest. There was a lot of the United States where they hadn't been. So when their records came out and they weren't getting on the radio, and their reach was really only people who had either seen the show or heard about the show, when they put out the first couple records, nobody was paying attention. And so the challenge from Columbia Records when it came time to make the third album was, how about you just make a single first, and we'll see if you can record a song that sounds like it has a chance of getting played on the radio.
So this is very much a kind of a reversal of the way things normally work, isn't it? That, later on, I've talked to many senior record executives who say you can very often only get bands to make a single once they've made the album. Once they've made the album, you said it's a really good album, but it needs a single. They're then happy to go away and make the single. Whereas in Springsteen's case here, they were saying, "Oh, okay, you got to place all your chips on one single. You got to be able to focus everything you do on that one record." And that's a pretty daunting prospect, isn't it?
Especially since in the early and mid 70s, singles and the top 40 had fallen very far out of favor. If you were going to be something like one of the more sort of like artistic, hip type of artists, sort of counterculture artists, the last thing in the world you wanted to do was to betray the fact that you were probably willing to do nearly anything to become successful. The idea was that you had to shelter your artistry from the commercial side of the business, and to the best that you could, it pretended didn't exist. And so Bruce was simultaneously determined to become a rock star, but on the other hand, equally determined to try not to do the things that went into actually becoming a rock star, like releasing hit singles.
So when was Born to Run identified as the song that might be the single?
Almost immediately. He started writing it right around the release of The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle in the fall of 1973. So by January of 74, he had the bare bones of the song, the outline, the music, and was working on the lyrics. So the early drafts of the lyrics were very dark and gothic and strange. I mean, almost like a horror movie where people are driving, roads collapse beneath the wheels of the fast rebel, and he eventually gets just run over by his own car, which rarely happens even in the United States. But the girlfriend, the beautiful surfer girl on the beach, dies of an overdose. I mean, it's very much hell visiting the earth. But as the winter wore on, he rewrote and rewrote and rewrote the song, and eventually came up with a version that sounded pretty similar to what we know now. It takes place on a recognizably modern, essentially Jersey Shore, but any town, USA.
But it was kind of different from what he'd written in the past, wasn't it? Was that because of the ambition that had to be invested in it?
Well, he was mastering his craft in a lot of ways. I mean, trying to learn to become a better songwriter, and the type of songwriter whose work was more accessible to a mainstream public. I think he was still determined to not write, shallow, silly songs that nobody would want to listen to, but or that had no value whatsoever. But on the other hand, he was also understanding, and talking this through with his then manager, Mike Appel, who was also a pop songwriter, the idea of, there is a construction to a pop song and some rules of thumb. Among them, don't be quite so discursive, like try to stay focused, keep your language simple and conversational. And, you can still do interesting things with music and evoke 50s rock and roll and evoke more artistic sort of prog rock almost. But it has to travel through this journey, hopefully in less than 4 minutes, which was just about the limit of what could end up on a top 40 station.
Because it's really interesting case, Born to Run, isn't it? Because it is still, I would say, the greatest record he made. Because it's the only one where you can say time stands still for Born to Run, doesn't it? You know what I mean? And it has that quality that it shares with loads of great records. Time stands still. When it starts, you've got to be there for the end. It is one thought all the way through. It transports you. You can't zone out of it, can you? It's compelling, like a Roy Orbison record is compelling, or a Phil Spector record is compelling. He seemed to be keying in to a tradition that people had forgotten about at that point. Is that fair to say?
Well, it had this kind of visceral crunch to it, and a very strong, just fundamental idea. Certainly, we think of it as an American ideal, which is that there's a highway right outside your door. And if things aren't working out where you are, if you aren't the person you want to be, you can get in your car, drive away, to whichever frontier, horizon feels most inviting, and reinvent yourself as a completely different person in a completely different place and make your own opportunities. There is, that's a very simplistic kind of description of like this American ideal, but essentially you're mobile. You can, you can be economically mobile, socially mobile, and definitely geographically mobile. Get the hell out of town and figure out what you want to be somewhere else.
It's the fundamental difference between British and American pop music, is that American pop music is all about geography. It's all about moving. It just is. You go and look at country music. It's all about blues music. It's all about I'm here, I'm going there. And things will be different when I go there. You will not find anything in British pop music that's like that at all. Because it's
Born to Run, one of the interesting things about Born to Run is the fact that when he actually refers to the destination, he has absolutely no idea where they're going. It's like to that place where we really want to go, and we'll walk in the sun. It's like, I'm sorry, Siri doesn't know where that is. But the thing that matters is having the guts to get up and go. Like, that's the crucial decision. Once you actually decide, I have it in me to reinvent myself somewhere else, I'm out of here. That is the moment of liberation right there. And ultimately,
go on.
In Bruce's world, the road would ultimately lead him right back home. And then he became, and that became his subject matter. But as a 25-year-old, it was all about just getting the hell out of town.
Was this the time when I know he's been quoted many times as saying, what did he say? I wanted to sing like Roy Orbison and sound like, I don't know, Dwayne Eddy or whatever. The kind of touchstones were all kind of late 50s, early 60s, reconnecting with that great kind of jukebox America. Did he have that in mind at this stage with the sound of the record?
Very much so. I mean, he was enamored of the first generation of rock stars, not out of simple nostalgia. Like, there was a big, as I'm sure you remember it, like after American Graffiti in 1973, there was, and starting before that, there were rock and roll revival concerts. There's this whole sense of like that 50s music, that original generation of rock stars had been really kind of shuffled out from public attention, and people were beginning to remember what they loved about that. But for Bruce, the idea was to take that sort of, battered standard of those original rockers and reconnect with the visceral excitement of it. Elvis in his leather jacket on stage, moving like he does, and that sense of deliverance and freedom being in some ways a purely physical thing. He wanted to connect with that, but he also wanted to weave it together with like Bob Dylan's intellectual heft and his grasp of poetry. The idea being that you can simultaneously have the visceral excitement of original rock and roll while at the same time being as intellectually engaged as you are listening to a Bob Dylan song. And so that was kind of a new idea. That was the cold fusion he was coming up with. And once they started working on Born to Run, the sound in his head was very Phil Spector. It was layered. It had that incredible sort of diaphragm rattling power that you got from a Phil Spector album, or song, I should say.
So it was kind of, he overloaded it in many ways, didn't he? Didn't he? Go and tell us about the practicality of making that record. Where did they make it? How did they make it?
Originally, for the first couple records, most of the recording was done basically live in the studio with just a couple of overdubs. So the whole band would set up and play like they played on stage. And that made a lot of sense on one level because the stage was where they were really at their most powerful. But on the other hand, they were recording at a studio in suburban New York, out 45 minutes outside the city. That was, a slightly more sketchy outfit. It was a converted gas station where the studio was in Blauvelt, New York. So eventually, when John Landau came on board and knew a lot more about the industry and about facilities in New York City, he said, you have got to work in a place that's going to capture the depth and the power of your sound. And along with that, John Landau, convinced Bruce that rather than recording live, he needed to, in order to get a live sound in the studio, it made more sense to actually lay down a basic track and then layer things one at a time and get that, real studio sound where you have that much control over the tone and the depth of each performance. And you can sort of jigsaw it together after it's all been played. And that was antithetical to Bruce's sense of what rock and roll should be, sound and feel like. But on the other hand, once they began to do that, he realized, oh, this is exactly right. Like, this is more powerful. And so, the idea was, let's see if we can't find a modern way to create that old school Phil Spector sound that just gets you, from the throat, with the first notes.
So just to go back to tell us, who was the band who made this, who made Born to Run? What kind of lineup are we talking about here?
There were a couple different iterations of the band that in the course of the making of the album. At first, when they were recording the single, it was the second generation E Street Band, which was obviously Bruce, Gary Tallon on bass, it was a fellow named Ernest Boom Carter who was playing the drums, who had joined to replace the original drummer Vinny Lopez. And then there's Clarence Clemens on saxophone, and David Sanchez on piano, and Danny Federici on organ. And then partway through the recording in the summer of 1974, David Sanchez got a contract to make his own records with Epic Records. So he left and took Boom Carter, the drummer, with him. And so in August of 1974, they had to stop everything and find a new piano player and a new drummer. And they turned out to be Roy Bittan and Max Weinberg. And that was the band that recorded the rest of the Born to Run album.
I do think it's so interesting. It's such a great record, Born to Run, the single. And it opens with the drums of Ernest Boom Carter, it was his only recording with that band, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was.
It's extraordinary to think that, really,
Yeah. And I've never heard Boom ever say like, "Oh man," I think those guys knew that they were on their own path and they really needed the opportunity to make that happen for themselves. And Bruce was, obviously sad to see them go, but on the other hand, he was really excited because he knew Sanchez was such a talented guy and had a lot of great music of his own to make.
Right. But so Steve Van Zandt is not in the picture at this point, is he?
No, he had been in a couple of Bruce's earlier bands and was, as far as anyone knew, a member of Bruce's band at the start of the recording of Greetings from Asbury Park. But when they got to the studio, Mike Appel very quickly told Bruce, "Listen, we don't have enough money to afford a second guitar player." So Bruce had to ask Steve to go, essentially. And it was kind of a crushing blow for Steve Van Zandt. But most of the way through the sessions for Born to Run, he came in to just check out what was going on in the studio and made an invaluable contribution to the horn arrangement.
Because one of the things he did while he was off on his own was he was with Southside Johnny in the Asbury Jukes, wasn't he? He was learning about horns. Go on, tell us.
Yeah. He was writing songs and producing for Southside Johnny, who was a sort of R&B singer from the Jersey Shore, from Asbury Park, which was where Bruce had really, made his bones with his earliest bands. And so Steve was doing his own thing. And so when he came into the studio to see what was going on with Bruce's sessions, they were in the middle of trying to record a horn section for 10th Avenue Freeze Out, which is, just an old school R&B song. But they had brought in the Brecker Brothers, Randy and Michael Brecker, who were leading, two of the most preeminent jazz and studio players in New York at the time. But those guys were used to playing written charts, whereas in rock and roll and R&B, when a session player comes in, you show him the outlines of the song and say, "Okay, go away and write your own part." And the Breckers were not accustomed to doing that and had no idea what would constitute an R&B horn part. So they did their best, but it was not working. And it took Steve, after watching this frustration in the studio for hour upon hour, to finally tell Bruce, like, "This sucks." And he got up and he went into the studio and he said, "Okay, guys, throw away the charts." And he just sang to them their parts. "You play this, you play this." And there was a trombonist, I think, named Carl Andre, who was part of the horn section that night. And he sang them the parts and they were like, "Oh yeah, that's actually way better." And they played them and knocked it out like in 1 or 2 takes.
But it was an extraordinary piece of nerve, wasn't it? Because the Brecker Brothers, as you say, were the kind of premier horn men of New York's session scene, but also at that time had their own records out, didn't they? They were selling records, probably more records than Bruce Springsteen. And
way more.
Yes.
That would not have been hard. I mean, they were successful jazz musicians and, and had their own band and were like first call horn players for all kinds of different sessions in New York. But when they hired him, when Mike Appel and John Landau and Bruce, who were all co-producing the Born to Run album, just thought to bring these guys in, I think they were hiring names. They weren't thinking about how whether these guys actually, they just assumed they would also know how to play R&B charts.
Right. But Bruce, in your account, he has a very clear idea of what he wants everything to sound like. So when he sits down with Clarence about, his part in what, I can't remember which tune it is, but he takes him through absolutely every phrase, doesn't he? How he wants it played.
Bruce knows exactly not only how he wants the part, what the melody of the part is, but also the tone and feeling and intonation of every single note. And so when Clarence came in to play his solos on She's the One, and then especially on Jungle Land, the climactic song, Bruce just forced him to play each phrase over and over and over again and recorded each performance of it, and then ended up kind of piecing them together from all these individual things. I mean, he was that determined to control every aspect of every note that was going to be played on the album.
Do you think this was because he felt he was in the Last Chance saloon? He thought, go on.
Yeah, he talks in Born to Run of a last chance power drive. And in a sense, he's talking about where he is in his own career. Because as the Columbia Records people had made it clear, if this doesn't work out, you are through here. This is essentially, you have one last chance, first of all, to make a single that's going to work. And second of all, to make the rest of the album that's going to work. And these cannot be like the two acclaimed records that you've already made for us, because those didn't sell. And so Bruce had to find an entirely new way to express himself, an entirely new image for himself, and really distill this idea that he had about the possibility of rock and roll, and how you could combine these traditional sounds and structures and feelings with a much more intellectually ambitious style of writing.
Which brings us neatly to the thing that always fascinates me about Born to Run, which is the cover.
Yeah.
Which is so important. 50 years later, it's even more important than anybody thought it was at the time. Tell us about that.
Well, he was working with a photographer named Eric Miola, who he had met outside a show in New York the previous year. And Eric, noticed that Eric was carrying a camera. And Eric said, "Oh yeah, I'm a photographer. Maybe I can come down to the Jersey Shore and shoot you." And Bruce was like, "Sure." So Miola came down, I think, in the summer of '74, and made some photographs that Bruce and his manager, Mike Appel, really liked. And so when the time came to think about the cover for Born to Run, they said, let's get that Eric Miola guy. And and Bruce talked to Eric, who understood sort of the working class aspects of Bruce's music. And he also understood when Bruce said, this has to be a very striking graphic image. And he really wanted to contrast the whiteness of his skin with the blackness of Clarence Clemens' skin, because he wanted to make a statement both about the fraternity of the band, the importance of the community of the band and their relationships, which were sort of distilled by his on-stage rapport with Clarence Clemens. But he also, had something he wanted to say about race relations in the U.S., which was then, as it is now, still fraught, And so the idea of an integrated band was still pretty radical. Up until, that first iteration of the E Street Band we were talking about earlier with Boom Carter and David Sanchez, they were both African-American guys. And so at that time, the band was evenly split between 3 black musicians and 3 white musicians. And for Bruce, that was a really important, a real important image that he enjoyed, broadcasting out there. So the idea was evoking that for the album cover, even in the absence of Davey and Boom, but with Clarence. And they had, confronted, because of the fact that they would travel into, not even into the Deep South. The whole country is racist. And so it was possible to encounter, angry racist types, even on the Jersey Shore. Like what is that guy doing here? He has no business being here, just simply because of the color of his skin.
What the other thing that fascinates me is the kind of what this says about the politics of the band and his position as the leader. in that he turned up at the photographer's house with Clarence, not with the rest of the band, which had to have been diplomatically very difficult with the rest of the band. You would have thought.
Well, I think, though, at the time, I mean, throughout his career, Bruce has been very adamant about the fact that he is a solo artist and his band is his band, but they are also his band. And and the idea of having Clarence on the cover, I mean, it's just like, I only need one of you guys to evoke the fact that we are a rock band who play, hard, striking rock and roll music. And, and it could be that these guys were less taken with the idea of their faces being on an album. But they were definitely
they're not on there at all, are they? Their pictures are not on the cover at all. Is that right? I think I'm right in saying that.
Yeah, and if you want to be technical about it, neither is Clarence. I mean, as Clarence told me when I interviewed him, the way the album folds, if you open it up, you see all of Clarence, and he looks amazing. But if you close the record and you put it on the shelf, what you see is Bruce Springsteen and Clarence Clemens' ass. As he says, he goes, he told me in 2011, he goes, I'm not on the cover. He goes, my ass is on the cover. Yeah. And, so eventually he was wondering, like, why am I just relegated to a body part?
I just want to take up this point that you've touched on, that he never made any secret of the fact that he is his band. And I always think, in the years since, he's far more interesting to me as a person on stage with the band than he can ever be on his own, because the movie is him and the band. It's the saga of him and the band, and things like 10th Avenue Freeze Out, which you talk about in the book. You say the title of the song means nothing whatsoever. It's just a cliche. It will do, won't it? But it becomes, when the big man joined the band and all that, that stuff became reenacted regularly, didn't it, as a ritual on stage up till the present day, pretty much. It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? And so much of that just goes back to Born to Run, is where the story begins, isn't it?
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, he starts to tell that story on Wild the Innocent and the E Street Shuffle, because what serves as the title track to that album, the song "The E Street Shuffle," is about like a particularly transformative night in a bar watching a band in presumably on the Jersey Shore somewhere. And so he was taken with the idea of the power of the band, musically, socially, symbolically. But it did take him until Born to Run to really distill it into its most vital essence, which is, this is a multi-ethnic rock and roll band. And, you can walk into, the meanest part of town where you could be subject to that sinister thing known as the 10th Avenue Freeze Out, and be utterly confident that you and the big man were going to tear the town in half. That you had the power, between you had the power and the authority to do whatever you wanted to do.
Right. So how did you go about researching this book? You actually go and listen to the tapes, yes?
Yeah, I got to go to what's now called Battery Studios in Midtown Manhattan, but used to be the record plant. And the facility now, I think, is owned by Columbia Records, or at least that's where they do their work. And so I just sat in a studio with an engineer for a week and listened to everything they had on tape from 1974, 75. Because Bruce sold all of his recorded archives to Sony. And and I just listened to every take of every song, and they didn't keep everything. It wasn't one of these things where there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours, but there was definitely more than 100 hours of, maybe there were hundreds of hours, but just hearing them just try to get that sound and that feeling just exactly right. And since they went into the studio, and Bruce was fairly unabashed about saying, we're going to make the greatest rock and roll album that's ever been made. You know, the stakes were high, and the tension was you know, you could cut it, you could hear it, especially on the early takes. And it takes a lot of energy for him to kind of get everyone to relax, to be able to play with the power and the verve that they needed to.
So you hear a lot of the chat in between them.
There's a certain amount of that. You know, the cool part, I mean, Bruce is joking around and trying to keep everybody loose and get a good take out of everybody. But to me, the part that was super thrilling that I wasn't aware of was the number of times that they kind of devolve into a jam session. So he plays, he played Needles and Pins and Louie Louie and Link Wray's Rumble. And they're talking about, it's the basics of rock and roll. And, you know, he's saying, like, we got to start playing Louie Louie. That always gets them going, you know. That.
Right. He's keying into that old tradition, isn't he? So now that Columbia, as you say, they've got all this stuff, is there going to be a kind of Beatles anthology kind of version of this stuff, do you think, where we're going to hear all those outtakes?
You would think that there would be. I mean, one of the things that's important to me, that was A, surprising, and B, thrilling to me, was that I'd spent so many years hearing all about the famous set of shows he played at the Bottom Line nightclub in New York City. And you just, you know, I've been hearing for decades and decades what legendary shows they were and how distinctive and how powerful the band was, and how that really was the moment of transformation in terms of, you know, the amount of attention that Bruce was going to get from the media and from Columbia Records, that they actually filmed 2 of those shows. And they're in perfect, professionally shot, crystal clear video. With, you know, which is professionally recorded as well, and those exist, but they still haven't put those out. Which is
it's
really,
like
the
Hammersmith shows that he did in the UK in 1975, wasn't it? Those were filmed at the time, and then they were sat on for 40 years or whatever it was. You know, as far as I know, the music was kept separate from the pictures, so they couldn't be put together, because he found the whole thing so upsetting.
Well, yeah, it was so interesting. I did a signing here in Seattle last night, and there was a fellow there who had been at the Hammersmith Odeon show on November 18th. He could recite the date, and he said, I was in the 4th row, and it was fantastic. It's like the entire place, it was like the second coming. But Bruce, for 30, 40 years, was saying, oh my God, we got so, you know, like, we played so badly, and the audience was so, unhappy.
No,
were you at those shows?
No,
Did you make it to
those? I wasn't at those shows, but I know the guy who filmed them, and they had difficulty filming it successfully because he insisted in those days on performing a very low light, and I don't think the low light cameras were not as good as they are now. But my understanding is that the pictures were kept separate from the soundtrack for I don't know. I was there, I think, in the late 80s when they were reunited, and nobody had seen them together since the occasion. But Springsteen's reaction to that was so much to do with the way that CBS in Britain had handled the promotion of it, really. And that poster saying "At last London is ready for," and of course you can't say that in London. Like, you can't say that.
Exactly.
You can't say that in New York. Is the worst possible thing to say, because those cities, they pride themselves on being massively blasé about everything. They just are.
Well, when you're the city where the Rolling Stones came from, and you're the city
whatever.
where David Bowie and the Kinks and all these great bands, and then you're thinking, like, we're just a bunch of jokers from the Jersey Shore, and we're. And you have us coming into London saying we're so much better than every single thing you've ever.
English audiences very much warm to the Jersey Shore or whatever kind of small part of the United States it might be. They identify with that massively. What they don't like to be told is that they've previously missed out on something. They don't like that feeling at all, you know. So he always felt that backfired on him in London, you know. And who knows? You know what it's like with anything. You can You can have a personal impression about something on the basis of something that somebody said to you in a bar or whatever that stays with you that nobody else knows about at all. That can happen.
Well,
go on.
Bruce is so wrapped up in his emotional experience of stuff that even after the Hammersmith Odeon shows came out on film and on record, and you can hear exactly how thrilled the crowd is and what a great show it is. He still, when I was talking to him for the biography in 2011, 2012, and I said, Bruce, I've seen, the subject of the Hammersmith Odeon shows came up, and I was like, I've seen the shows. It's like they're spectacular, A, and B, the crowd is going crazy. And he's just shrugs and goes, well, that's not how it felt to me. He's still, and he goes I still think it sucked. I still think it was terrible. It's like, I don't like to think about it or talk about it. And I go, dude, it's a great show. And he's like, who cares?
But I think that's quite an honest response. That is, he knows how he felt. He stood there in the middle of it. He knows how he felt.
Well, but the thing about Bruce, though, he's got these two internal voices that have sort of followed him through his life since he was little, which is, on the one hand, he was a golden boy. His grandparents just adored him, and they were his primary caregivers for the first few years of his life, while his parents and he lived in their house, and they took care of him during the day. But his dad, who suffered from bipolar disorder and had a really difficult time connecting with anyone emotionally, his attempt to try to distill strength and self-reliance on his son made Bruce feel like, as he put it, a waste of space. He thought his dad had contempt for him. And so these contrasting voices of you are the greatest that ever was versus you are an utter outcast, he takes with him. And so when he began to get worried about the amount of publicity that he was getting from the record company and the amount of hype and people saying he was the greatest thing ever, it made him feel like that bar is too high and I'm too big of a loser to ever be able to clear it. And so when he would walk into a situation like the Hammersmith Odeon, where his praises are being sung at such a, high velocity, he was like, I cannot stand this. And he began to tear those posts. He tore all the posters off the wall and shredded all the sheets of paper that said, finally, London is ready for Bruce Springsteen. And, and he took that fear with him, the idea that these Londoners are not going to want to hear that I'm the greatest. Like that, I'm immediately starting like 6 feet underground. They're gonna walk in here wanting to bury me because I've told these incredibly hip, savvy Londoners that they need me, and they don't need anybody, and they definitely don't need me.
It's a fantastic tale, and never told better than here. And this out now, tonight in Jungleland, The Making of Born to Run by Peter Ames Carlin. Peter, as ever, pleasure to talk to you. What's next?
Oh my God, vacation. I've been, it's been kind of a hectic summer around here. And, but right now I'm just promoting this book and trying to get the word out, and I'll be traveling around a bit in the US over the next few weeks. But, then I'm just going to try to take a vacation.
Right. Absolutely. Quite right. Okay. Well, look, lovely to talk to you.